For coming out on such a beautiful day when you could be at the beach or up in the mountains. We're waiting for the show to turn on here. Thank you.
All right.
Is the show coming up? Oh, that's behind the scenes. I want to thank Bobby and Sarah and the others for putting this together. It looks like a lot of work to put together a conference like this as a volunteer, so thank you very much.
What's it titled? Is it on the flash drive?
Stokely. No, it's on the hard drive.
It's titled Stokely.
Stokely HSU. No, we don't have the pictures up yet. I spent about 25 years working on restoring the Trinity River and its tributaries. I spent 23 years with the County of Trinity and the last 5 with Seawind. When I worked for the county, they always told me to tone it down. I was really an activist in disguise. When I went to work for Seawind, they said, could you please be a little more harsh with those letters and be a little more extreme? So it's been kind of a change from being a bureaucrat to being an activist, although I've really always been an activist at heart. And it's funny how you end up in certain places and you're not quite sure how you got there, but that's another story for another time. So this is Trinity Dam with some nice colors in it. It's a 2.5 million acre foot reservoir. It's part of the Trinity River Division of the Central Valley Project. And of course, we all know whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. I think actually these two guys are from the Klamath Basin. I could swear I've seen that guy on the right at one of the meetings. And it is an interesting situation. I'm sorry I missed the show last night on the Klamath Basin. The reason that water's for fighting in California is because of our geography and our population base. This is a map of precipitation. You can see that there's lots and lots of precipitation up in our part of the state and very little in the southern part of the state. And yet if you go to the population centers, obviously there are many more people down south than there are up north. It's almost the inverse of precipitation. And California's water system is linked north to south. This is a map of all the reservoirs and canals in the state of California, and essentially you can release water from the Trinity Dam on the Trinity, and it can go all the way to San Diego. Even though San Diego is not in the place of use for the Central Valley Project, those molecules of water can go all the way down there. In a sense, you could even back water up into the Klamath reservoirs by releasing from Trinity. It's a little complicated, but water flows uphill when money's involved. Here's the Klamath River Basin, which you learned about last night. The Trinity is the largest tributary of the Klamath River. Trinity Reservoir is right here. Like all major water projects, there's a large reservoir that holds most of the water, and then there's a smaller regulation reservoir below it. In the case of Trinity, it's Lewiston Dam and Lewiston Reservoir that are below it. And so it's really not the largest part of the Klamath Basin, but it is the largest tributary. And one of the big differences between Trinity Reservoir and the reservoirs in the upper Klamath Basin is that Trinity is very deep, it's very cold. The water coming out of Trinity Dam is usually about 44, 45 degrees, very low in nutrients, as opposed to the Klamath dams in the upper basin that are quite warm and quite full of nutrients. This is a conceptualized drawing of the Trinity River Division from 1952, when the Bureau of Reclamation was just thinking about the project. You've got, of course, Trinity Dam, Lewiston Dam, and then this tunnel is now called the Clear Creek Tunnel, and it goes down to Whiskeytown Reservoir down here. Then it goes through what's now called the Spring Creek Tunnel, over to Keswick Reservoir, which is the regulation reservoir below Shasta Dam. So Trinity River water is really, in my opinion, the most valuable water in the state of California. The reason being is that it can provide water to the Trinity River, the lower Klamath River, as well as the Sacramento River. Also, because there is such a large drop from Lewiston Dam down to the Sacramento River, it produces a huge amount of hydropower. On an acre-foot basis, it produces 3 times the electrical energy that an acre-foot of water from Shasta Dam does. So it's very, very valuable, and it's definitely worth fighting over. California's water system was originally based on damming numerous North Coast rivers. The Trinity River project is really the only North Coast river that was dammed. There were plans for the Smith, the Eel, the Van Dusen, the Mad, and probably some others I'm missing, the Klamath. And so what happened when Ronald Reagan, here on the right, was president, he designated several North Coast rivers as wild and scenic. And then when Jimmy Carter became president, actually one of the last things that his Interior Secretary Cecil Andrus did is that he added all those North Coast rivers into the wild and scenic river system. The reason that this is very important to water stories in California is because the State Water Project was predicated on damming those North Coast rivers. They were planning on bringing in 5 million acre-feet of water from the North Coast rivers, and the Trinity is the only one that was dammed. However, even though they did not get that 5 million acre-feet of water, the State Water Project, which is run by the State Department of Water Resources, they sold water contracts of about 4.4 million acre-feet of water, even though they only had about 2 million acre-feet of water to provide. We call that paper water. It's water that somebody has in a permit, but it doesn't really exist in reality. In the case of the Trinity River, the Bureau of Reclamation has water rights to about 6 or 7 times more water than actually exists in the river. In the Central Valley and the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, there are water right claims to about 5 times more water than actually exists in a normal year. So this sets up a huge conflicts throughout the state of California, which we constantly see, and of course we saw earlier this summer with the lower Klamath River augmentation flows from the Trinity River, and there was litigation over that. The Trinity River is a long story of losing your water, the chickens getting out and trying to put them back in. Back in the 1950s, when Congressman Claire Engel was promoting the project, he was a Democrat under the Eisenhower administration. And these water projects under the Bureau of Reclamation were really considered socialist projects. The idea was to dam up rivers and distribute it to small family farmers who would have 160 acres. The water would be subsidized so that they could essentially develop the West. And in the case of the Trinity River, it was sold to the people of Trinity River as a great benefit to them. Claire Engel said, not one bucketful of this water will be taken out of this basin that's needed here. The argument it'll ruin fishing is absolute nonsense. Of course, they were all complete lies, and I think that he probably knew it at the time. But one time I was before a congressional committee, and the chairman asked me, well, how was it, Mr. Stokely, that back in 1955 the people of Trinity County supported this project because the Board of Supervisors signed on to it? And I looked at him and I said, well, those were the days when people believed the government. He didn't laugh, but a bunch of other people did. So in 1955, Congress passed the act to dam the Trinity River. In 1959, the permits were issued and the dams were completed around 63. The average annual flow of the Trinity River at Lewiston Dam is about 1.25 million acre-feet. At that time, they gave the river 10% of that, 120,500 acre-feet of water, which amounted to about 150 cubic feet per second 9 months of the year, or 10 months of the year, and 250 CFS for another couple months of the year. And it basically killed the river. And because of the Hoopa Valley Tribe and the Yurok Tribe and their federally reserved fishing rights, it became a great incentive and actually a mandate by the Interior Department to restore the Trinity River and bring the fisheries back. There's been a whole series of legislation regarding the Trinity River. There was the 55 Act. which did have a clause in it to preserve and propagate the fishery, which was very unique at the time. It was a do no harm clause. In 1984, there was a Trinity River Basin Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, which allocated $60 million to restore the river. And in the words of one Metropolitan Water District official back then, we want to do everything we can for the Trinity River except give it more water. So the concept was to spend money on the river to make up for the water that was being diverted. Then in 1992, Congress passed a law called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which essentially mandated that a 12-year flow study by the Fish and Wildlife Service be completed, and if the Hoopa Valley tribe concurred, that the flows on the river would be increased permanently. So this is a picture of Hoopa Valley Tribal Chairman Dwayne Sherman in the bow. Mike Thompson, I believe, is behind him, and then Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt and another tribal member in the back of the boat. And on December 19, 2000, Babbitt and Dwayne Sherman signed the Trinity River Record of Decision. It took another 4 years of litigation for the water to actually flow, but it was a huge moment. Again, originally the flows were 10% of the natural flow. Now it's about 47% of the natural flow. This is just a schematic of the different kinds of flows. They're based on 5 different water year types. Depending on how much water comes into the reservoir, a certain amount gets released. These are the different water year types on the right. You can see it goes from, I think it's 369,000 acre feet up to 815,000 acre feet. 815,000 acre feet is a lot of water. It's a heck of a lot more than 120,000 acre feet. The peak flow is 11,000 cubic feet per second. Compare that to the old flows of 250. It's huge. And it is starting to change the river. But the real issue that I want to talk about is paper water. Currently, the Bureau of Reclamation has 8 water permits with the state of California. Even though they're a federal agency, they're subject to state water laws. Their permits still have the old 120,500 acre feet a year. So basically, according to their water permits, the Bureau of Reclamation can sell all the water on top of 120,500 acre feet a year. And yet, if you look at those flows that I showed you on the previous slide, the weighted annual average is almost 600,000 acre feet of water. So there's a huge discrepancy between what the Bureau is permitted and what's actually in their water rights. It amounts to 474,000 acre feet of paper water. This is just one example in the state of California of paper water. The problem is that the Bureau of Reclamation has sold this water. They have water contracts with many water agencies in the Central Valley, in particular the Westlands Water District, which is where this water was intended to go. And they do not receive 100% of their contract amounts anymore at all. So every year, even if they get 80% of their contract amount, they whine about it because they're not getting 100%, even though back in the 50s and the 60s when these contracts were signed, it was very clear that their contracts could be cut back. But that has not stopped them from continually suing over Trinity River flow releases, including this year. Southern California, you know, everybody up here talks about all the swimming pools in Southern California and how all our water's going down there. Actually, 80% of the developed water supply in California goes to agriculture, not urban areas. But Southern California does get water, not through the Bureau of Reclamation, which is the agency that dammed the Trinity, but through the California Department of Water Resources and the State Water Project. They essentially have several sources of water, which is, the State Water Project from the Delta. They get groundwater. They get water from the Colorado River, which California has been taking too much of for many years, and we've been cut back, so that's been reduced. They also get groundwater. And of course, they also get water from Mona Lake and the Owens Valley. But the Delta water, I think, is about 1/3 of their water supply in Southern California, and it's very important to them. Where does this water go? Well, it goes to what we call the Metropolitan Water District and its member agencies. The MET, we call it, or MWD. It's a wholesaling water agency that serves wholesale water to all the agencies from way up in Ventura County all the way down to San Diego. There are a number of water agencies there. Each one of those water agencies has its own governing board, and then they buy water from the Met. The Met's in a position where they're in business to sell water to all these water agencies. So even though they do have some conservation programs, they don't want to cut back too much on their water sales because it'll cut into their profits. Many of the agencies are trying to reduce the amount of water that they get that's imported. They're increasing their recycling, and that's not always agreeable to the Met. One of the other big elephants in the closet is the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority. These are folks who primarily buy water from the Central Valley Project, from the Bureau of Reclamation. Westland's Water District is the largest district within that organization, and they're also the controlling entity. They bought out some of the other water districts, and so they have a controlling membership on the board of directors. Westland's is 600,000 acres. It's as big as the entire South Fork Trinity River watershed. These folks are very litigious. I've sometimes likened them to the water mafia. When I worked for Trinity County, I would go to Sacramento and testify that if you would retire this land because it's full of selenium and it has salt problems, I testified that if you would retire that land, you could use the water to help the Delta, the San Joaquin River, and the Trinity River. It was so upsetting to the manager of Westlands at the time that he called me up on April Fool's Day, 2004, and it was kind of like a Tony Soprano phone call. It was like, you threw down the gauntlet, you started it, we'll finish it. It was really pretty scary because at the time I was working for Trinity County and they were facing imminent bankruptcy, and I actually did back off on some of my activities at then, but subsequently I retired and now they can't do anything to me, so it's great. This is the Delta, and you may have heard about the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. What it is it's where the San Joaquin River comes in to the Sacramento River. It's an estuary where the two rivers come together. It's essentially the hub of California's water supply. In the case of the Bureau of Reclamation, water comes down the Sacramento River, both from the Trinity, the Sacramento, as well as the American River, and it comes down here. And if you imagine you were a salmon going out to see a salmon smolt, you get down here to the confluence of the San Joaquin, and you just keep going right out through the Golden Gate. But the problem is that the federal and the state pumps are in the southern delta here. The Harvey Banks Delta Pumping Plant is the State Water Project pumping plant. The Tracy Pumping Plant here is the Bureau of Reclamation. The Bureau pumps into something called the Delta Mendota Canal, and DWR pumps into the California Aqueduct. So what happens is when they run these pumps down there, they're huge. Collectively, between the two of them, I think they can divert almost 15,000 cubic feet per second. So when the tide's coming in and the pumps are on, when a salmon smolt moves down the Sacramento River, instead of going out to the ocean, taking a right turn, it takes a left turn, and it goes up the San Joaquin River. And then all these little waterways here are different channels between these delta islands. These land areas here are islands. They were farmed as early as the 1850s and 1860s. It's peat soil, and that soil tends to oxidize with time, and so what's happening is the islands are subsiding, so they all have levees around them. And imagine these are all almost like little reservoirs, except they don't have water in them. But if a levee breaks, and if a bunch of levees broke, you would have a massive influx of salt water from the ocean, which would then contaminate the pumps in the South Delta. And so there's a concern that if there were earthquakes or whatever, or sea level rise, that those levees would break. And so it's being used as a justification by Governor Brown and his administration, Westlands and the Met, that they're trying to scare people that these delta islands are going to fail in an earthquake on the Hayward Fault. Massive salt water will intrude, and a portion of the water supply for 2/3 of California will be unavailable. And Governor Brown, in July of 2012, he said, I want to get shit done. He's, 72 years old. He tried to have a peripheral canal in the early 80s, but it went to a referendum and it failed 2-1. So he's basically come back with a new idea. And that is the peripheral tunnels, or the twin tunnels. Now, this is the delta again. So currently the water goes this way through the delta to the South Delta pumps. The concept is that he wants to put intakes on the Sacramento River upstream of the delta to then put in 2 tunnels 30 to 40 feet in diameter under the delta for 30 to 45 miles so they can take it down to the state pumping plant down here. The concept is that if the levees break, they would be upstream of all that salt water, and the water supply for Southern California would be safe. The problem is that these tunnels that they're proposing don't really take care of the problems. And I will add also that the so-called twin tunnels or Bay Delta Conservation Plan, again, similar to the Trinity River back in the 80s when they were spending money and not wanting to use water, it's the same thing here. They want to take more water out of the delta than they have been, and to make up for it, they're proposing to do habitat restoration on 100,000 acres. The problem is that 100,000 acres is prime farmland with senior water rights, and the farmers in the delta are not taking this lightly. This is not a fish versus people issue. This is a farmer versus farmer and people versus people issue. It's not a north-south issue either. The thing that they really want is they want to get a 50-year permit under the Endangered Species Act so that they can basically limit the amount of water they have to give up for endangered species and also limit the amount of money that they would spend on it. It turns out that the beneficiaries would theoretically pay for this project. However, they're expecting the public to pay for this habitat restoration, state and federal taxpayers through bonds and other means that essentially we borrow money. Now, I said earlier that they feel like they're not getting enough water out of the delta. This is a graph that shows historic water diversions from the delta. You can see back in 1956 they weren't taken very much, whereas I think that was 2011 or 2012 they took record amounts of the delta. And so these people are claiming they're not getting enough water out of the delta because of endangered species, but the reality is they've been getting quite a bit and they've been taking too much. We actually have a Department of Water Resources Bulletin 76 that indicated if they were unable to dam the North Coast rivers that they would run out of water and they would have to deplete the common pool in the delta starting in 1982, way back here. So they already knew 3 decades ago that they didn't have enough water, but they've continued to promise more water than they can deliver. They have not reduced the amount of water contracts, and the water rights are not consistent with the available water supply. And also you can see that the red is the State Water Project pumping, and the blue is the Central Valley Project pumping. The CVP pumping has not increased that much over the last decade, but you can see that the State Water Project has taken quite a bit more water in recent years, again, because they have more contracts than water that they can deliver. So the idea of the twin tunnels is to reduce this earthquake risk and the intrusion of salt water in the delta. The problem is that it's not the real risk to the water supply for Southern California. The California aqueduct that serves Southern California with water runs parallel to and crosses the San Andreas Fault. This is an earthquake map. You can see up in the delta that the risks aren't nearly as great as they are down in Southern California and elsewhere. In fact, there's never been a levee break in the delta from an earthquake, not even from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So it's basically scare tactics to try to get people to support the twin tunnels. The other huge risk is San Luis Reservoir. It's a very large reservoir south of the delta that they pump water in during the winter to use in the summer for irrigation, and it sits on an active earthquake fault. I don't remember the year, but there was a year a couple decades ago where a portion of the dam actually failed. The reservoir did not drain, but they are required to do a remediation plan for this, and their so-called plan to restore the delta and protect water supplies is completely silent on San Luis Reservoir and the risks that are there. One of the other issues is sea level rise. Now they're claiming they need these tunnels so that they'll be protected from sea level rise, but they also say that they're going to continue to use the South Delta diversions and not use the new delta pumps in drier years. Well, you can't see this very well. It's kind of like a contour map, but these lines are lines of where the salt water intruded up into the delta historically. In 1931, this line up here, the water was all the way up to where the current intakes are. So what's going to happen with the saltwater intrusion when we have really dry years in the future and maybe with 20 inches of sea level rise? These tunnels and their intakes are going to be completely obsolete. Again, they're not looking at the big picture, and what they're doing is they're saying they're going to save the delta, they're going to help it. But how do you save something by taking all the water out? It's kind of like during the Vietnam War, there was a village named Ben Tree, and the U.S. Army destroyed it, and one of the officers is famous as saying, well, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. It's the same thing here. And again, there are many farms that have ancient water rights, not ancient, but very senior water rights in the Delta, and by taking the water out of the Delta before it gets there, that water in the Delta will be salty, and those farmers will see their crops fail. So it's really a fight to the death for those folks. And then they're going to spend, they say it'll be $15 billion for the tunnels. Of course, they don't count interest. Maybe another $10 billion for habitat restoration. We think that instead of a $25 billion project, it's probably going to be $60 or $80 billion. And yet, according to the director of the Department of Water Resources, they're not going to pump any more water out of the Delta. So why would you spend $25 billion for a project that isn't going to assure your water supply reliability? It isn't going to give you any more water, and the water agencies that get this water are going to have to pay a lot more money for it, as are their retail customers. There's something called price elasticity. We see it when the price of gasoline goes up. People use less gasoline. It's the same thing with water. So if we imagine all these water agencies in Southern California have to double their water rates to pay for this project, and they don't have any more water to sell, at some point they're just not going to make their revenues, and we think that it may very well cause a lot of bankruptcies of municipal water agencies that would be getting this water. It's also a very poor investment. The University of Pacific estimated for every $2.50 you spend on the project, you get $1 in benefits. The state came up with its own economic impact study, but they rigged the results. They actually assumed that if they don't build the tunnels, they'll lose more water than they are now, which is really a ridiculous assumption, and it's not the same baseline that they use in the environmental documents. Again, I talked about paper water, and one thing about the paper water is that the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources, their water rights to the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers are junior to other senior water right holders, such as the farmers in the Delta, or the farmers on the east side of the San Joaquin River, or some of the senior water contractors in the Sacramento Valley. So if you actually get down to it, if there's a serious drought, there isn't any extra water available to export south of the Delta, but the state's going through a lot of different gyrations to basically disenfranchise senior water right holders, put the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources first in line. But if you really looked at the water supply for these tunnels, it's just not there. Also, they're claiming it's going to be a state project, not a federal project, so that way they avoid the federal cost benefit analysis that the Bureau of Reclamation does. The public's going to pay hugely for it. They're relying on bonds from the state of California. Recently there was a poll that said a majority of Californians wanted to fix our water system, but when they asked them if they wanted to pay, only 36% said that they would. There are federal appropriations that are going into this that are taking money away from other projects such as conservation and recycling. One of the other things that these guys are really good at doing is claiming public benefits for a project when in fact it benefits these water agencies and not the public. A classic example is they're planning on, the Bureau just did an environmental impact statement on raising Shasta Dam up to 18.5 feet. The project did not pencil out economically if the water contractors were to pay for it. So what they did is they claimed that by raising Shasta Dam, it would increase the cold water pool for salmon in the Sacramento River. There would therefore be an increase in salmon production, and therefore the public should pay 60% of the cost to the tune of $655 million, even though raising Shasta Dam is nowhere as a conservation project by any fishery agency, and there's certainly no guarantee that the water would be used for fish. It's simply a phony way for them to come up with the public to pay for a project that Westlands Water District and other heavily subsidized water users will get the water from. In addition, the construction of the tunnels is supposed to be paid for by the water users, but the bonds will be backed by the state of California as what they call revenue bonds. So if for any reason any of those water agencies can't make their payments, the state of California and the taxpayers are on the hook to pay the bill. And based on our analysis, we believe there will be a number of water agencies that will simply be unable to pay for this project. The state of California already has $125 billion existing debt. 7.7% of our general fund budget goes to paying off borrowed money, particularly bonds these days. The more money we borrow, the worse our credit rating is. And for every $1 billion that we borrow in bond money, it's about $56 million a year that comes out of the general fund for 30 to 40 years. That's money that could go to education, such as Humboldt State. It could go to police and fire protection, health services, the whole array of things that we've seen cut back in recent years because the state of California is so broke. If we fund these projects, if we vote for these bond acts, we're basically voting to reduce general fund expenditures on things like education. The other thing is that they claim they're going to use adaptive management to manage the project. They say, just let us build the tunnels and we'll tell you how much water the fish get later. Don't worry, trust us. So they've set up an adaptive management process that's ultimately governed by something called the authorized entities. And look who's on the list. Is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife or the National Marine Fisheries Service there? No, it's all the beneficiaries or the water agencies that deliver the water. And they've made it so that any adaptive management decisions have to be unanimous by the biologists. Trying to get unanimity amongst biologists is not easy. And of course, it'll then default to this group and they'll make the decision that's best for them, not for the fish. It's a completely corrupt process. It's also very environmentally destructive. Essentially what it is right now, because the Delta is a bottleneck on sending water from Northern California to Southern California, it keeps water in our northern reservoirs. It keeps water in Trinity Lake. It assures that there is a cold water supply to release for the lower Klamath River, as well as the Trinity and at times the Sacramento River. By building this project and giving them a 50-year permit, it'll allow them to drain the northern reservoirs, combined with climate change, where we'll see reduced snowpack. One of their model runs shows that in a simulated drought in 1990, 91, and 92, the Trinity River will have 0 flows in it because there will be no water in the reservoir. It removes fresh water from the Delta, increases salinity. They're also going to have 27 million yards of cubic muck that they'll have to dispose of somehow. 100,000 acres of prime Delta farmland will be taken out of production. And the other thing is that they'll deliver more clean water from Northern California to the poison ground in the western and southern San Joaquin Valley. Those areas are ancient ocean beds. The soils are full of selenium, boron, salt, and as they irrigate, the plants take up the fresh water, leave salt that naturally occurs in the water, leaves it in the soil, so they add more water to leach the salt out of the root zone. It percolates downward and picks up all these toxic chemicals in the soil. By doing this project, we'll be putting more clean water on poison ground. And again, there's no specific fish protection or flows. The other concern we have is that since there isn't any additional water available, what they plan on doing and what they're already doing is they will mine the groundwater in the Sacramento Valley. There's a huge aquifer there called the Tuscan Aquifer. It feeds off of runoff and percolation from the Sierra Nevada as they draw down those aquifers, the small streams on the east side of the Sacramento Valley, where some of the last wild spring Chinook exist in California. Those creeks will dry up, as will small wells. The city of Chico uses a number of wells for its water supply. If you imagine the Tuscan Aquifer is like a swimming pool with the kiddie pool, the shallow part at the east end, so as they draw down the aquifer in the center of the valley, the kiddie pool goes dry, and all those people on the east side, including a lot of orchards, will not have water. And we saw that happen, I believe, in 1992 when the Department of Water Resources had a drought water bank. We saw many wells go dry. And of course, impacts to the Klamath and Trinity. As most of you know, the Trinity River is now used to prevent a repeat of the 2002 fish kill. In 2003, 2004, 2012, and 2013, additional flows beyond the record of decision flows were released from Trinity and Lewiston dams into the Trinity and then into the lower Klamath to prevent a repeat of that fish kill. There was litigation over it this year, and the Westlands Water District and San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority got a temporary restraining order from a federal judge in Fresno, and he delayed the flows for 10 days. However, thanks to the expert testimony of several witnesses from the tribes, he released the water and there was not a fish kill. But if Trinity Reservoir is empty because of the twin tunnels or drought, there will be no water to release. There will be no relief for the lower Klamath River. We'll also, as I mentioned earlier, see a loss of public services from increased water bond debt and decreased public expenditures from the general fund, inadequate flows, and also competition for funding. I think that's a huge issue. We know that this project's going to cost more than $14.5 billion to build these tunnels. The Bay Bridge, I think the original estimate was, what, $1.1 billion, and I think it ended up around $6 billion. These kind of projects often go with cost overruns. And in this particular case, they're drilling tunnels that are 150 feet under the delta, and thanks to the lawyers of the delta farmers, the DWR has been unable to do a lot of geotechnical drilling, so they really don't even know what they're getting into. So if the price goes up, where's the extra money going to come from? We don't know. So what's the solution? Well, there is a solution out there. Recycling, conservation, stormwater capture, brackish, groundwater desalination. The Natural Resources Defense Council came out with what they call a portfolio alternative as an alternative to the twin tunnels. While it still has only one tunnel, it does have a portfolio of these other actions, and they determined that for about every $1 billion you spend, you get 200,000 acre-feet of water every year. Orange County does a great job of recycling their sewage. They turn it into drinkable water, then they percolate it back into the aquifers and use it again and again. The largest flow of fresh water into the Pacific Ocean in Southern California is the sewage. Why would you spend millions, billions of dollars sending water hundreds of miles to then just flush it out into the ocean? Why not recycle? The technology's really coming along. San Diego really wants to wean itself off of imported water. They just had a task force that recommended more recycling, more conservation, and they also recommended stormwater capture. They basically said that the stormwater that runs off their streets is cleaner than the sewage, and so why should they dump it into the ocean where it does become a pollution problem? They could recycle it and turn it into usable water. So one of the things we, of course, want is a water availability analysis. Actually, CWIN already did it. That's where we came up with the 5 to 7 times the amount of water available. A public trust balancing. They haven't done that with this. They claim that there are lots of benefits to Southern California, but they haven't looked at the subsidies, they haven't looked at the real costs, and so we want them to look at that. They did that with Mono Lake. They did a public trust balancing, and they looked at, well, what's the value of Mono Lake, and what would it cost to do low-flow toilets, low-flow shower heads in Southern California and Los Angeles, and I think they have over 1 million more people than they did 20 or 30 years ago, and yet they use the same amount of water. That's a true public trust balancing that they have not done here. And of course, enforce existing water quality regulations. There are delta salinity standards to protect the farmers down there, and the Bureau and DWR have consistently violated those for the past 5 years with the blessing of the State Water Resources Control Board. The other thing we want is to limit delta exports to about 3 million acre-feet a year. And what are the other alternatives? Well, it turns out that you can improve the levees in the delta and protect that water system from saltwater intrusion for $2 to $4 billion, a heck of a lot less than the tunnels and all the associated restoration. The state says that they can't do that and they won't do that, and yet they still plan on using the South Delta diversions during drier years, so this is to their advantage, but they won't even consider it. The other thing we need is cold water, enforceable cold water pools in the reservoirs. For instance, Trinity Reservoir, even though it's 2.5 million acre-feet, the average annual inflow is about half of that. So when Trinity gets very low during drought, it takes a long time to refill unless you have a big year. Once the reservoir gets below about half full, you start having warm water discharges coming out of the dam, and it's not available for the fish. If we go into a multi-year drought, even without the tunnels, it's possible Trinity Reservoir could be drained. We need to have some kind of enforceable cold water pool that will allow the fish to have cold water for multiple drought years. One of the other issues is something called the Monterey Agreement. It's a state water project secret deal that the DWR made with the Met and some of its big contractors back in 1994. The state water project was founded on the fact that there would be extra water available for agriculture during the first few years of the project, and as the urban areas reached build out, then agriculture would give up that water to the urban areas during drought. What they did in the secret Monterey Agreement is they eliminated the urban water preference for the state water project. So when there's a drought now, the urban areas have to share it with the farmers in Kern County. That basically creates a permanent drought in Southern California. If they reinstated the urban water preference, quite a few of the problems that those agencies have would literally go away. One of the other things they did in the secret agreement was they gave away the Kern Water Bank, which is a massive underground storage area south of the Delta, and they also gave that away in exchange for 40,000 acre-feet of paper water that did not exist. Increased efficiency, recycling, screening existing diversions. The current pumps in the South Delta do not have adequate screens. They were supposed to be screened years ago, but the irrigators and the Met refused to pay for it. And of course, to meet fish recovery standards. Local solutions. This is not a north versus south issue. If you know people who live in urban Southern California, talk to them. Tell them how they're about to get hoodwinked. Basically, the urban Southern California people are going to be asked to pay for this project. They will not get any more water from it. And Westland, San Luis, Delta Mendota, and Kern Water Agency will probably get more water, but Southern California will get less, or not less, but they won't get any more, but the urban people will be paying for it. So they're going to get fleeced. Conserving water is really big. You know, there are thousands and thousands of water main leaks and breaks every year in California. We lose lots and lots of water. We really need to take care of those. And of course, any technical expertise or support for Seawind is greatly appreciated. So that concludes my talk on the peripheral tunnels, and I'm happy to take any questions from anybody. I guess I said it all, huh? Dr. Nelson.
Several questions. One is, how many fish do we need in the rivers? There's, an excess of fish in the ocean now this year. So no one ever says this is how many fish we should strive for.
Actually, okay, he asked me how many fish should we be striving for. He says there's lots of fish in the ocean that maybe we've already got enough fish. Actually, there are very specific salmon restoration goals for the state of California, as well as the federal government. There's something called the Fish Doubling Plan. The state of California back in the 90s passed a law that, the populations of salmon should be doubled. I forget the base year, but they've actually plummeted since then. The Central Valley Project Improvement Act also had a similar goal, which has not been met. The Trinity River actually has very specific goals for each species, both for hatchery fish as well as for natural production, which would be fish that spawn in the gravel. What we found on the Trinity is that the hatchery goals are more than met and the natural production goals are not met. What we really have is a surplus of hatchery fish in the system, which weakens the genetic stock and probably ultimately will undo our runs and they'll crash. What we really need to do, at least my feeling is on the Trinity River, is we need to reduce hatchery production and increase natural fish production. So I hope I answered your question, Denver. There are very specific fishery restoration goals for the Central Valley and the Trinity River, and we are not meeting them.
Well, I guess sort of further along that same idea, there's a lot.
Yes.
Well, the bottom line, as I see it, is there's a lot more people in Southern California than there are up here. And they don't really care about salmon.
No, they don't, but they care about money.
Well, maybe, but, I get very discouraged when I sort of look at the big picture of what's going on. And there's got to be some accommodation worked out. You can't just say we're not going to have any of these projects because they are going forward like a steamroller.
Well, I agree with you, Denver, that we should not put our heads in the sand, and that's why we do have the California Environmental Water Caucus's Responsible Exports Plan, ewccalifornia.org. We have a very detailed plan there on how to reduce Delta exports and still provide the water for Southern California. I think one of the biggest ways that we can save water is to take that poison land out of production in the western and southern San Joaquin valleys. In 2002, I believe it was, the year of the fish kill, when Trinity County, who I was working for, was facing imminent bankruptcy, Westland's Water District, their subsidies, their water and crop subsidies amounted to $100 million just for 1 year. We're basically putting our money and our resources in areas where we shouldn't be. But because these people make so much money, they have influence to legislators, to excellent lawyers, and it's very hard to beat them. But we should not be sending clean water to poison ground. The other issue is recycling and conservation. I mean, the bottom line is whether you believe that climate change is occurring from man or not, the sea levels are rising, the ice caps are melting, our snowpack is not as abundant as it used to be, and Southern California needs to find another way to get its water, because even if they build these tunnels, the water is not there unless maybe they decide to dam the North Coast rivers and get rid of those wild and scenic river designations, but the water simply is not there, and they need to think about other solutions. This is not a solution to Southern California. This is a ruse for them to get a 50-year permit under the Endangered Species Act so they can pump to their heart's content, but it is not a solution for Southern California at all. And if you look at many of the agencies in Southern California, they agree. Long Beach, San Diego, Santa Monica, they're all reducing their imported water. That is their goal, is to use more local water supplies, recycling, and conservation. So I don't think it's a lost cause, Denver. I realize we're rolling rocks uphill fighting the powers that be, but from a fiscal perspective, this doesn't make sense to Southern California. So when we go down there and talk to them, we don't talk about the Delta, we don't talk about the Trinity River, we talk about how much it's going to cost them and their pocketbooks. Santa Barbara is a classic example. They were told if they hooked up to the State Water Project to get state water, that it would only cost them $270 million. The pipeline itself cost $600 million. By the time you added in interest and all the other charges, it was $1.76 billion. We're sure that the same thing's going to happen here. In the case of many of those water agencies in Santa Barbara, they didn't need the water, or they only need it during drought years. While our organization is not a proponent of ocean desalination, they had a desal plant in Santa Barbara. I looked at how much they spent on state water, how much they got, and it would have been cheaper for them to do desal than it would have been to do State Water Project water. And they could have just cranked up their desal plant when they had a drought and then used their local sources otherwise. So I hope I answered your question, Denver. I refuse to give up. Any other questions? Back there?
I'm personally from Southern California.
Yes.
And do you think that the cost of getting water, making that more expensive to deter people from using water they don't need, would help?
Yes, and they're already doing that. And the problem is as I mentioned, price elasticity. The water agencies down there have been forced to increase their costs, which then means people use less water, and they do conserve. But the problem for the water agencies is then they have less income because they're selling less water, and then people conserve, so then they raise their rates, and then people use less water, and it's kind of a spiral to bankruptcy. So if you add this kind of project on top of the existing financial obligations that those agencies have, they're much better off spending it on a project that will actually give them more water, like recycling or stormwater capture, than on a project that will increase their indebtedness without giving them a drop more water to sell. It just doesn't pencil out economically. So I hope I answered your question. There's a woman in front of you there.
I don't have a question, I just have a simple statement. This is one of the best presentations I've heard today, and thank you. This was wonderfully done.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Question over here.
I don't know how to ask this question, but with the human population demand on water right now, is it possible, feasibly possible, to satisfy all limits?
I believe it is. We still in California, we have some of the highest per capita use of water in the world. In Europe, they use much less water than we do. We're very profligate users of water here in California, and for the urban areas, most of the water goes to outside landscaping. If people could switch to native plants and xeriscapes, it would save huge amounts of water. But the bottom line is that agriculture uses 80% of the developed water supply here in California, and a significant portion of that does go to poison ground, which is heavily subsidized. Crop subsidies, water subsidies, electrical subsidies, you name it, drainage subsidies. There is a better way. But the problem is that these water agencies are tremendously wealthy. They have control of the governor, they have control of the Interior Department, and so our plan is we're going to go out and beat them in the court of public opinion, but we also file comments on environmental documents. We have attorneys. We believe there will be several lawsuits that we can file that can stop this project. We've already filed the first one against something called the Delta Plan by the Delta Stewardship Council. We filed that earlier this year, and we intend to continue filing lawsuits until we drop dead.
I guess that was just kind of my question. Where does it stand as far as progressing forward? Has it been approved? Will it be a vote, or is it mostly in the courts right now?
Well, we have several strategies. One is if we could get some of the major water agencies to drop out, such as the Kern County Water Agency, which is the largest agriculture user of state water project water, we think that the project might die. And Kern has already expressed very strong reservations about the project. Why should they spend lots of money for no more water? So that's one strategy. The public draft environmental impact statement and report is supposed to come out on the streets November 15th. Probably the only good thing about the budget shutdown in Washington is that for every day that the budget is not approved, that environmental impact statement and report is delayed. So we just hope that it'll go away, but it won't. So once that's done and they approve a record of decision on it, we will likely litigate on that. They also have to go to the State Water Resources Control Board, which is the state agency that controls all water rights in California, and they will have to get a permit to change their point of diversion, and we're already very involved in proceedings with the State Water Board as well.
I had a question about the funding mechanism for the Twin Tunnels project. I'm assuming the state water bond would be one of those. And my question is also related to the Klamath Dam removal process, and how might removing Klamath dams be tied to building the Twin Tunnels?
The original water bond that was approved in 2009 had, I believe, $250 million in there to remove the Klamath dams. It's pretty clear that the public is not going to go for an $11 billion water bond, so the legislature is now in the process of trying to downsize it. I haven't followed it that closely, but do you know, Andrew, if they removed any of the money? I think some of the proposals would remove the money for the Klamath dams from them. But at this point, it does not look like the legislature can get a 2/3 vote to change the bond. It was originally scheduled for 2010. They delayed it until 2012. Now they've delayed it till 2014, and my guess is they'll delay it again. So the bottom line is it's very unlikely at this point, unless the economy really rebounds, that they're going to have this Bond Act money for all this so-called habitat restoration. And on the issue of habitat restoration, they claim it's going to bring the fish back, but if you look at the comments from the federal fishery agencies, there's no indication in their minds that this habitat restoration will actually do good for the fish, and they've expressed a number of concerns that it may actually lead to the extinction of a couple of races of Chinook salmon on the Sacramento River. So much for a conservation plan. One final thing is Jerry Merrill, who's the Deputy Resources Secretary who's in charge of this project. I had a wonderful conversation with him in the middle of April when I was with the Winnemem Wintu tribe, and we were having a private conversation. He was essentially trying to buy me off. He said, because that's what he does. He goes around the state and talks to the different groups, and he says, well, what is it that we can give you that you'll support the tunnels? So he said to me, well, what is it that we could do that would protect the Trinity River? And I said, there's nothing we can do. It's not going to help the Trinity River in any way. And I said, and it's not going to save the Delta either. And he said, oh, well, BDCP, that's the name of it, Bay Delta Conservation Plan, is not about saving the Delta, and it's never been about saving the Delta. Somebody was standing behind me to see if I was going to sell out. She took notes, put it out over the internet, and there were probably 40 articles. Some congressman asked to have him lose his job over it, which was not my idea. But I think he was really speaking the truth. This project is not about saving the Delta, it's about getting more water for subsidized agriculture. Gentleman back here.
The subsidized agriculture, the subsidized cotton growing in the Central Valley.
Cotton's a subsidized, federally subsidized crop. The problem is it's not very profitable, really, even with the subsidies. And so what's happened down there is even though these water agencies have contracts where they could literally get a zero allocation in a dry year, they have put in permanent crops such as almonds, pistachios, grapes. I think an almond tree takes 4 acre-feet of water to grow down in that area, but they could be cut to zero in any year. So one of my friends calls it the Westlands Death March, because they're basically putting all their crops into permanent crops, and yet they have a 100% interruptible water supply in any year. So that just gives them more grounds to whine about how, you know, they're not getting enough water, but in fact, they're the ones who signed the contracts that said they could lose all their water in any year, and they're the ones who made the decisions to grow these crops.
It's kind of a question about the original adjudication of the water rights. With the climate change, things like that, at what point do the technical hydrologists say, wait a minute, all this has to be reallocated because the resource isn't there?
What do you,
Is there something that allows that to happen?
well, what this gentleman asked was, at what point will there be an adjudication of the water rights? Is that really your question? An adjudication is where the State Water Board goes and looks at who has what water rights, what water right claims, and who's the most senior, and basically when there's a drought, who gets water and who doesn't. Actually, before the State Water Project was even built, there was a gentleman who did a report, and he felt that the entire Central Valley should be adjudicated before they even built the State Water Project, because he did not believe that there was adequate water available. The state ignored him. They built the project anyway, but at this point, the Central Valley has not been adjudicated. Maybe some of the tributaries have, but it has not been adjudicated. And that's sort of like the nuclear threat. The nuclear scenario is an adjudication where you basically get all the water right holders in the room, they all present their case, and then these 5 people who are controlled by the governor will make the final decision on how that water is allocated. It will probably come to that at some point, but politically it's very unpalatable. And I will add again that the State Water Board is 5 appointed people by the governor, and that's one of the fundamental problems with water in California, is that the State Water Board, that's supposed to be an impartial, quasi-judicial branch of government to deal with water quality and water quantity, they're completely controlled by the governor. So they're not unbiased, they're not impartial. Any other questions? Well, thanks very much for having me over here, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. And if you have any questions, my contact information is up on the screen here. Get a hold of me. Thank you.